They sat there, sipping wine, smirking as they whispered about me, the poor one in the family. Every word dripped with condescension, each laugh cutting deeper than the last. I stayed quiet, letting them believe their little fantasy. What they didn't know was that outside, something was about to shatter their smug little world, and it came with the deafening roar of rotor blades. If you've ever been underestimated or mocked by those who thought they knew your worth, you'll want to hear how this plays out. Stick around, hit that like button, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? I've never been the kind of woman who needed to show off. I don't drive flashy cars, I don't post pictures of expensive vacations on social media, and I don't casually drop the price tag of my clothes into conversation. My life is comfortable, more than comfortable, but I've always preferred to keep it that way quietly. You see, when you run your own company and it does well, you learn something about people. The more they think you have, the more they want from you. Over the years, I've found that keeping my success to myself has protected me from a lot of fake smiles and greedy hands. But apparently, it hasn't protected me from judgment. My family, well, complicated, is a polite way to put it. We're not particularly close, but we meet a couple of times a year for these so-called family gatherings. Sometimes they're holidays, sometimes they're birthdays, and sometimes they're just excuses to drink too much wine and gossip about whoever isn't in the room. When the text came through from my cousin Emily, "Big family meeting this Sunday at Uncle Robert's. Everyone will be there. Don't miss it." I hesitated. My first instinct was to politely decline, as I usually do. But then I remembered it had been over a year since I'd seen most of them, and part of me thought, maybe it'll be different this time. Uncle Robert's house is exactly what you'd expect from someone who likes to impress people. A sprawling suburban property, with a perfectly manicured lawn, and a foyer designed to make you feel underdressed the moment you step inside. I pulled up in my understated silver sedan, parked discreetly at the end of the driveway, and walked in carrying a homemade pie. It's the kind of entrance that says, "I'm here to enjoy the company, not to show off." At first, things were civil enough. We exchanged the usual hugs and fake smiles. Aunt Linda asked about my work, though I could see her eyes glaze over before I even finished my first sentence. My cousin Mark bragged about his new boat. Emily gushed about her husband's promotion. I listened, nodded, and sipped my coffee, content to stay in the background. But the mood shifted when the conversation turned to money, as it always does. Someone mentioned the rising cost of living, another complained about property taxes, and soon everyone was swapping stories about their latest purchases and investments. I kept quiet, focusing on my pie, but that didn't stop the attention from turning to me. "So, how's business?" Mark asked with a smirk that suggested he already had an opinion. "It's going well," I replied simply. "That's good," Aunt Linda chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I mean, you've always been, how should I put it, humble with your lifestyle, not like some of us who really go for it." A few chuckles rippled around the table. "Yeah," Emily added. "We were just saying you're like the minimalist of the family. It's kind of cute. Cute, minimalist, humble." Each word landed like a little dart, carefully aimed but dressed up as a joke. "That's one way to put it," Mark said, leaning back in his chair. "I mean, I guess when you don't have much, you make it work, right?" There it was, the jab they'd been dancing around all afternoon. I don't have much. To them, because I wasn't flaunting wealth, I must not have any. And in that moment, I could feel the shift inside me. I'd let their little digs slide for years, thinking it wasn't worth the energy to correct them. But this time, something about the smugness in their voices, the way they looked at each other as if sharing some private joke at my expense, lit a spark I couldn't ignore. I smiled, took another bite of pie, and said nothing. Not because I agreed, but because I'd already decided how the rest of this afternoon was going to go. They thought they knew me. They thought they could define my worth based on what I chose to show them. But what they didn't know was that I had something up my sleeve, something that would wipe those smug grins right off their faces before the day was over. And the best part? I wouldn't have to raise my voice or say a single cutting word. All I'd need was timing, precision, and a little noise from above. The conversation didn't just stop at the poor joke. Once that door was cracked open, they all seemed eager to step right through it. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table like he was about to deliver some grand life advice. You know, maybe you should think about getting into something a little more lucrative. I mean, running a business is fine, but don't you ever feel like you're just scraping by? I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness coat my tongue. Scraping by, he said, as though I hadn't spent the last decade building my company from the ground up, navigating sleepless nights and impossible deadlines, turning it into something that provided jobs for dozens of people. But to him, because I didn't broadcast my success, it didn't exist. Emily chimed in, her tones syrupy sweet. Oh, Mark, don't be so harsh. I'm sure she's happy living simply. Not everyone needs to aim for the stars. That's true, Aunt Linda said, nodding with a smile that wasn't really a smile. Some people just aren't cut out for more, and that's fine. The words felt like they had weight, pressing down on me, each one carefully crafted to sting, while still allowing them to pretend it was all in good fun. I'd dealt with this kind of thing before. In high school, I was the quiet one, the girl who didn't make waves. At work, before I started my own company, I was the reliable one, dependable but never dazzling. People liked to put me in neat little boxes, and for years I let them. But something about this moment felt different. Maybe it was the way they laughed together, like they were sharing a joke I wasn't part of. Maybe it was the smug satisfaction in their eyes, the way they looked at each other as if to say, "See? We know her. We've got her figured out." Or maybe it was the fact that no one, not a single person at that long, glossy dining table, bothered to speak up for me. Not even to say, "Hey, that's enough." I realized then that this wasn't just about me being humble or minimalist. This was about them needing someone to feel superior to. And I was the perfect target, because I let them believe their version of me was real. My fork clinked softly against my plate as I set it down. I looked around the table, letting my gaze linger on each of them. Aunt Linda with her perfectly styled hair, Emily with her diamond bracelet, Mark with his smug little grin. And in that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with them. I wasn't going to stand up and rattle off my bank balance or my list of achievements. That would only give them more ammunition, more reason to twist my words into another joke later. No. If they wanted to believe I was poor, then I was going to let them. At least, until the moment came to show them just how wrong they were. I excused myself from the table, saying I needed to make a quick call. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. I walked far enough from the house that no one could hear me, then pulled out my phone and scrolled to a familiar name in my contacts. "Hey, it's me," I said when my pilot answered. "Yeah, change of plans. Can you be here in about 40 minutes? The field behind Uncle Robert's place. You know the one. Perfect. Just circle once before you land. And make it loud." When I hung up, I felt a flicker of anticipation spark in my chest. Not anger, not even satisfaction yet. Just the quiet thrill of knowing I was about to turn the tables in a way they'd never forget. Back inside, I slipped seamlessly into the conversation again, nodding and smiling at whatever new story Mark was telling about his latest business venture. They didn't notice the shift in me, the way my eyes kept flicking toward the big bay window that overlooked the back lawn. Minutes ticked by, and with each one, the knot in my stomach loosened. I wasn't just enduring the afternoon anymore. I was counting down to the moment it would all change. Then Emily started in again. "You know," she said, swirling her wine glass, I sometimes wonder if you're holding yourself back. Like, maybe you're afraid to try for something bigger because you don't want to fail. A few heads nodded in agreement, as though she'd just said something profound. I smiled. Maybe you're right, I said, my voice calm. Or maybe I just like doing things my way. They laughed, a little too hard, a little too knowingly. And then, faint at first but growing louder, came the sound. Whump! 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 At first they didn't notice, but as the rhythmic thudding of rotor blades grew stronger, conversation faltered. Heads turned toward the window. Mark squinted. Is that? I set my coffee cup down, leaning back in my chair. Sounds like a helicopter, I said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The sound grew louder still, rattling the glass. Someone stood to look outside, and within seconds, the room was in motion. Chairs scraping, voices rising, everyone rushing toward the back door. I stayed seated, watching them gather on the patio, shielding their eyes against the sun as the dark shape descended toward the field. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral, almost bored. They wanted a show? I was about to give them one. The helicopter hovered for a few seconds before beginning its descent, the wind from the rotor blades sending leaves and bits of grass swirling into the air. From inside the house, I could hear the startled exclamations of my family, a chorus of "What's going on?" and "Who's that?" I rose from my seat slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. The trick to making an entrance isn't just the arrival, it's the build-up. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let them get just a little uncomfortable before the truth hits. When I stepped outside onto the patio, all eyes were fixed on the aircraft as it touched down on the open field behind the house. The noise was deafening, the kind of sound that drowns out every whispered comment, every smug laugh, the kind of sound you can feel in your chest. Uncle Robert's jaw hung open. Mark was gripping the railing, his knuckles white. Emily's hair whipped around her face as she tried to shield herself from the wind, her diamond bracelet catching the sunlight. I didn't say a word. I just walked past them, each step deliberate, my heels clicking against the stone. The pilot stepped out first, dressed in a crisp uniform, and opened the side door with a flourish. "Ma'am," he said, his voice just loud enough to carry over the noise. I nodded in acknowledgement, stepping closer so they could see it wasn't just some random helicopter landing for dramatic effect. It was my helicopter, with my pilot, here for me. Mark's voice cracked as he spoke. "Wait, is this yours?" I turned to face them, letting the question hang for a beat. "Yes," I said simply, then climbed into the cabin without offering any more explanation. From my seat inside, I could see them through the tinted windows, still standing there, still staring, their earlier confidence slipping away like sand through fingers. I didn't need to see their expressions up close to know what they were feeling. Shock, confusion, maybe even a twinge of embarrassment. The pilot leaned in. "Do you want me to take a quick loop around?" I smiled. "Yes. Make it a slow pass over the house before we land again." As we lifted off, the field shrinking below us, I caught sight of Emily pointing up at the helicopter, saying something to Aunt Linda, who shook her head like she couldn't believe it. The same people who, just 20 minutes ago, were so sure of my place in the family hierarchy were now craning their necks to watch me soar above them, literally. The loop was quick but purposeful. We passed over the house once, the shadow of the helicopter sweeping across the lawn, and then circled back for another landing. The whole time, I sat back in my seat, letting the moment sink in. This wasn't about showing off wealth for the sake of it. It was about dismantling their narrative without a single argument. When we landed again, the pilot hopped out and opened the door. I stepped down, the sun warm on my face, and adjusted my blazer before walking back toward the patio. The crowd had shifted. They weren't smirking now. Emily was the first to speak. I didn't know you flew in helicopters." I gave her a small smile. There's a lot you don't know about me. It wasn't said with malice, but it landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading in every direction. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, clearly trying to recover some control over the situation. So, is this something you do often? From time to time, I said. It's convenient for business meetings, cuts down on travel time. I let that last part linger. Business meetings, travel convenience. The subtext was clear. I operated in a world they hadn't even considered I could belong to. The best part? I still hadn't raised my voice, boasted, or listed off a single accomplishment. All I'd done was show them a glimpse of a life they'd assumed I could never have. Inside, I could feel that quiet satisfaction building. This was just the start. I wasn't here to humiliate anyone outright, just to remind them that underestimating me was a mistake they wouldn't soon forget. And from the stunned silence hanging over the patio, I knew the message had already started to sink in. The air still vibrated with the hum of the helicopter's blades, even after they slowed to a stop. My relatives lingered on the patio, half pretending to be nonchalant, half craning their necks for one last look at the sleek machine behind the house. I knew their minds were spinning. The woman they'd spent years pegging as simple and humble had just stepped out of her own helicopter, and I wasn't going to waste the opportunity to let that reality sink in deeper. Would you like a tour? I asked casually, glancing toward the aircraft. Mark's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Emily, ever the opportunist, spoke up first. Oh, yes, I've never been inside one before. We walked across the lawn, the grass crunching softly underfoot. The pilot held the door open as I gestured for them to climb in. Inside, the leather seats gleamed, the console panels dotted with glowing switches. A faint scent of expensive upholstery filled the cabin. This is incredible, Emily whispered, running her hand over the stitching on the seat. Doesn't it cost a fortune to maintain something like this? Mark finally asked, his voice caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. It's not cheap, I admitted with a shrug. But when you value your time, you make investments that give you more of it back. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The implication was enough. I operated in a league where this was a calculated tool, not a frivolous luxury. We stepped back out into the sun, and I noticed Aunt Linda hanging behind, her eyes darting between me and the helicopter. She'd been one of the loudest voices in the earlier conversation, the one who'd so sweetly suggested I wasn't cut out for more. Linda, I said warmly, next time you're in the city, let me know. I'll fly you in for lunch. My treat. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, like she wasn't sure whether to accept or pretend she didn't need the offer. That's very generous, she finally managed. Back inside the house, the conversation shifted. Instead of asking condescending questions about my little business, they wanted to know about flight routes, destinations, the cost of aviation fuel. I answered some, dodged others, letting them work to piece together the picture on their own. Then came the subtle power play, the invitations to do something together soon, the sudden warmth in voices that, just an hour ago, had been dripping with superiority. By the way, Mark said, attempting casualness, I'm working on a project that could use some outside investment. Maybe we could talk sometime? I smiled politely. I'll think about it. We both knew I wouldn't. What made this part so satisfying wasn't just the shift in their tone, it was watching them realize they'd been wrong all along, and knowing they were scrambling to rewrite the version of me they'd held onto for years. As dessert was served, I pulled out my phone. Excuse me for a moment, I said, stepping onto the patio again. I made a brief, entirely fabricated call about a Monday meeting in Chicago, deliberately mentioning the helicopter for transport. When I stepped back inside, the room was quieter. Eyes followed me, curiosity and maybe even a hint of respect, replacing the thinly veiled disdain from earlier. The thing about people who judge you is this: they don't expect you to rise above their judgment without trying to prove them wrong in words. They expect defensiveness, explanations, maybe even an argument. What they don't expect is for you to simply live at a level they can't reach, and let them witness it. By the time the gathering wound down, the helicopter was still parked outside, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. A silent reminder that I hadn't just visited them that day. I'd left an impression that would outlast the sound of the rotor blades. And as I hugged them goodbye, I noticed the difference in those embraces. The stiffness was gone, replaced by something almost deferential. It was subtle, but I caught it. They'd never look at me the same way again. Ever had someone judge you before knowing the full story? Moments like this prove you don't need to argue. Just let your success speak. Stick around, because what happened next at that patio left the entire family stunned and silent. After the plates were cleared and coffee poured, the buzz from the helicopter had faded, but the tension it left behind still hung in the air. Conversations were quieter now, more cautious. I could see it in their eyes, the calculation, the reassessment. But I wasn't done. The helicopter was just the opening act. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching them shift in their seats. It wasn't about gloating, it was about balance. They'd spent years talking over me, around me, sometimes as if I wasn't even in the room. Now they couldn't look away. That's when I decided, if they wanted a version of me to fit into their hierarchy, I'd give them one they couldn't ignore. I pulled my phone from my bag and opened a folder I rarely showed anyone. Inside were images from boardrooms and construction sites, charity galas, and business launches. Proof, not just of wealth, but of the work behind it. The idea wasn't to shove it in their faces, but to weave it naturally into the conversation, to make it impossible for them to cling to their old assumptions. I waited for my moment. It came when Aunt Linda started talking about her son's new tech job. "He's been traveling for work," she said proudly. "Just got back from Chicago last week." I smiled. "Chicago's a great city. I was there last month for a meeting with one of my project partners." I let the words project partners hang for a beat, then turned my phone toward her, showing a photo of me standing beside a prominent CEO in front of a high-rise. Her eyes flickered. Recognition, surprise, maybe a little discomfort. "That's impressive," she murmured. From there, it was easy. Emily asked where the meeting had been, so I showed a picture from the private conference room overlooking the city skyline. Mark wanted to know what the project was, and I pulled up a short video clip from the groundbreaking ceremony of a property development I'd co-financed. Each reveal was casual, almost reluctant, as though I hadn't meant to bring it up, but was simply answering their questions. The truth was, every image and story was calculated to dismantle their perception of me, brick by brick, and it was working. They leaned in closer. Their questions were no longer tinged with condescension, but with genuine curiosity, maybe even admiration. The shift in their posture told me they were starting to see the gap between their imagined version of my life and the reality. Still, I wasn't going to unload everything at once. The final move, the one they'd never forget, would come later, in full view of everyone, with no way to brush it aside as coincidence. For now, I was setting the stage, planting seeds, letting the truth take root slowly, so when the full picture appeared, it would hit twice as hard. I slid my phone back into my bag and took another sip of coffee. "Anyway," I said lightly, "it's not as glamorous as it looks, just a lot of hard work." That line always worked, humble enough to deflect envy, but still impossible to dismiss. Inside, I could feel the anticipation building. My moment was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't just be a reveal. It would be the undoing of every smug comment, every raised eyebrow, every whispered remark they'd ever thrown my way. It happened over dessert. Aunt Linda had brought out her famous pecan pie, the one she bragged about as if it were a family heirloom. Plates clinked, coffee refills were poured, and for a brief moment, The conversation almost felt normal again. Then Mark decided to test the waters. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "are you renting that helicopter? Or is it like one of those shared charter things?" The table went quiet. I could practically hear the unspoken question behind it. Is this real or just a stunt? I set my fork down and smiled. "No, Mark, it's mine. Bought it last year. It's part of the company's transportation assets." He blinked, his smirk faltering. "Company's assets?" "Mm-hmm," I said casually. "My company. The one that manages our property portfolio, logistics, and a few other ventures." I didn't have to elaborate, but I could feel the collective curiosity prickling in the air. I reached into my bag and pulled out a glossy folder, the one I'd brought for a Monday meeting, but knew would be perfect for this moment. Inside were renderings of a new luxury development project, high-end apartments, retail spaces, a rooftop garden. My name was printed on the cover page under the words, "Managing Partner." I slid the folder across the table toward Mark. "This is what I've been working on lately. We're breaking ground next quarter." He flipped through the pages, his earlier arrogance evaporating. Emily leaned over to peek, her perfectly manicured finger tracing the skyline in one of the renderings. "This is huge," she said softly. Linda, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Why didn't you ever tell us about all this?" I met her gaze evenly. "Because I don't need validation from anyone here. And because every time I came to one of these gatherings, the conversation was never about sharing. It was about comparing." No one moved. No one spoke. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady but calm. "You all decided years ago who I was. You decided I was less successful, less interesting, less everything. And you were comfortable keeping me in that box. I didn't feel the need to correct you. Until today." Mark cleared his throat. "Well, I guess you just assumed," I cut in, not raising my voice but making sure the words landed. "And now that assumption doesn't fit anymore, does it?" The silence that followed wasn't the awkward kind. It was the heavy, uncomfortable kind. The kind that comes when people are forced to see themselves in a mirror they didn't ask for. Finally, I pushed back my chair and stood. "I should get going. My pilot has another flight tonight." I walked toward the door, hearing the shuffle of footsteps behind me. The late afternoon sun lit the yard as we stepped outside. The helicopter sat there, gleaming, the pilot already doing pre-flight checks. I turned to them one last time. "Thanks for the pie, Aunt Linda. And thank you all for the interesting conversation today." I let the smallest smile curl my lips. "See you at the next family meeting." The rotors began to spin, the air whipping around us. My hair blew back, my coat lifting slightly in the wind. As I climbed in and closed the door, I caught one last glimpse of their faces, a mix of awe, discomfort, and the dawning realization that the version of me they'd clung to no longer existed. The helicopter lifted off, carrying me higher and higher, until the house was just a dot below. But even from that height, I knew the image of me leaving like this would stay burned in their minds for a very long time. The next day, my phone lit up with messages, far more than usual after a family gathering. Aunt Linda sent a long text about how impressed she was and how she had no idea I'd built such a successful business. Emily left a voice message, her tone dripping with warmth, inviting me to lunch sometime soon to catch up properly. Even Mark, the self-appointed authority on everyone's life choices, sent a terse, almost awkward, "You've done well for yourself." I read them all without replying, not out of spite, but out of clarity. The helicopter ride, the portfolio, the subtle reveals, they had done exactly what I intended, shifted the dynamic. But shifting it didn't mean I wanted to invite them all back into my inner circle. For years, these gatherings had been an exercise in endurance for me. I'd show up, smile, endure the sideways comments and casual dismissals, and leave feeling smaller than when I'd arrived. Yesterday changed that. I thought about the look on their faces when I'd told them I didn't need their validation. That wasn't a line I'd rehearsed. It was simply the truth. I'd spent so long proving myself in the real world that I didn't realize I'd stopped caring about proving myself to them. Still, boundaries needed to be set. I decided that from now on, I'd attend family events on my own terms. No more letting them dictate the narrative about me. If the conversation drifted toward comparisons or veiled put-downs, I'd politely disengage. If anyone wanted to know about my life, they could ask, and listen, without the sneer. That afternoon, I sent a single group message. Yesterday was enlightening. I'm glad we could all catch up. Moving forward, I'd like our family gatherings to focus on connection, not competition. See you all next time. Short, direct, and not open for debate. Later, as I sat in my office reviewing contracts, I felt lighter. Not because I'd won anything, but because the weight of their assumptions had finally been lifted off my shoulders. I'd drawn a line in the sand, and they'd seen what was on the other side. The calls kept coming for a few days. Some were genuine attempts to reconnect. Others felt more like damage control. Either way, I handled them the same way. Courteous, but measured. The truth was, I didn't mind seeing my family. I just refused to be the version of myself they had invented years ago. The version who was easy to dismiss, easy to overlook. Yesterday had reset the balance. Now, I could step into any family gathering without flinching, knowing the playing field had been leveled, maybe even tilted slightly in my favor. And while part of me enjoyed the poetic justice of the moment, a bigger part of me simply felt free. A week later, life had settled back into its usual rhythm. Morning coffee, back-to-back meetings, evenings reviewing proposals, or reading in the quiet of my living room. But there was still a faint echo of that family gathering in my mind. Not the noise of the helicopter or the flash of surprise on their faces, but the feeling that something inside me had quietly clicked into place. For years, I'd told myself it didn't matter what they thought of me. I had my work, my friends, my own life. Why should the approval or disapproval of a handful of relatives carry weight? And yet, in the deepest corners of my heart, it did matter. Not because I needed their praise, but because no one likes being misunderstood, especially by people who share your last name. That day didn't just prove them wrong, it proved to me that I'd already been living beyond their judgment. The helicopter, the folder, the casual reveals, those were just props. The real power came from the fact that I hadn't needed to do any of it. I could have left that gathering still underestimated, and my life would have gone on exactly the same. Realizing that was oddly freeing. It also softened something in me. I thought I'd walk away feeling smug, maybe even triumphant, but the truth was different. Yes, there was a certain satisfaction in watching the assumptions crumble, but there was also a quiet sadness. How many years had been wasted on this silent rivalry? How many genuine moments of connection had been lost because we were too busy measuring each other against invisible scorecards? A few days after, Aunt Linda called. She didn't bring up the helicopter or the business. Instead, she asked how I was doing, how work had been, and, more surprisingly, how I'd been feeling. It was the first time in a long time I sensed she actually wanted to listen. We talked for 20 minutes. Nothing groundbreaking, but it was a start. That conversation made me realize something important. Sometimes people need a shock, not just to see you differently, but to open the door to seeing you at all. My family and I might never be close in the way some families are, but maybe now there was room for a different kind of relationship, one built on mutual respect instead of quiet judgment. As for me, I decided to let go of the bitterness. Not because they deserved it, but because I did. Carrying that resentment was like holding on to a debt I had no intention of collecting. On a Sunday morning, a week after the gathering, I took my coffee out to the balcony. The city stretched out before me, the hum of traffic below blending into the distant thrum of another helicopter somewhere far away. I smiled at the sound, not because it reminded me of that moment, but because it reminded me of how far I'd come, and how much further I could go without needing to prove it to anyone. The aftertaste of that day wasn't victory, it was clarity. And clarity, I realized, was worth more than any dramatic entrance or pointed remark. In the end, the real healing didn't come from making them see me differently. It came from finally seeing myself clearly and liking what I saw.